He hung from a tree like a discarded ornament, his legs bound so tight the fur had split, his muzzle gagged with filthy cloth. The flies found him first, then the silence. Not a bark, not a whimper, just the shallow rise of a chest that still refused to give up. No one knew how long he'd been there, maybe hours, maybe days. But as the sun scorched through the pines, something stirred in the branches above. Eyes blinked. Wild eyes, watching. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you. Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The midsummer heat settled like a wet quilt over the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. It was the kind of heat that dulled the world, made the trees hang heavy with silence, made breath feel slow and shallow. Deep in the forest, far from trails or signs of people, something moved only when the wind pushed it, a limp figure hanging upside down from a low pine branch. Max was a 2-year-old German shepherd, once strong and vigilant, now nearly lifeless. His sable and black fur was filthy, stretched tightly over bones, and flies swarmed around his face. His hind legs were bound by thick rope to the branch above, suspending him in the thick air. A soiled strip of cloth wrapped tight around his muzzle kept him from crying out. He no longer fought the bonds. There was no one to hear him anyway, no one, except them above. Nestled between the limbs of an ancient hickory tree, a band of raccoons watched in silence. 5 of them, alert, suspicious, wild. Their eyes reflected patches of sunlight and dust, the largest among them. A scar-faced female with graying fur and steady movements. Tilted her head, her name, had it ever been spoken, would have been Scout. Scout had lived through many things, traps, storms, starving winters. She had learned when to run and when to vanish, but today she did neither. What hung below wasn't prey, and it wasn't danger. It was something else, something broken, something hurting. Scout let out a sound, short, sharp, a signal. The other raccoons stirred, descending the bark and creeping along mossy roots toward the strange creature. One sniffed the air and stepped back. Another reached up, pawing gently at the limp form. The rope creaked but didn't give. Scout stood still, watching everything. Max didn't react. His eyes were half open, dim. His chest rose and fell in shallow gasps. Scout made another noise, and the smallest raccoon began to bite gently at the knots. It was slow work. The rope had been pulled tight by malice and time, but raccoon teeth were nimble, persistent. The sunlight shifted through the canopy. A breeze stirred the leaves, and finally, one strand of the rope frayed, then another. Somewhere, not far from the clearing, footsteps moved softly over pine needles. 14-year-old Ellie Monroe had been walking aimlessly for hours. Her boots crunched over twigs. Her denim jacket clung to her arms despite the heat, since arriving at her grandfather's cabin 2 days earlier. She had not spoken more than a few sentences. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to be anywhere. Ellie had her father's eyes, a soft hazel green, though they looked dull now. He'd been a forest ranger, brave, kind, someone who made the world feel less frightening. When he died in a rockslide the year before, something inside Ellie had collapsed. Her mother said she needed space, so now she lived with Gus Monroe, her father's father, in a wooden cabin tucked into the edge of the preserve. Gus was kind in the way trees were, quiet, strong, present, but unfamiliar. The forest had been her father's world. And so, day after day, Ellie walked it like someone pacing through memory. She didn't see the raccoons that day, nor did she see Max, but the trees were beginning to whisper, and soon their voices would pull them all together. The forest, drenched in late afternoon heat, buzzed with a restless kind of silence between the tree trunks. Shadows stretched long and thin, dappling the undergrowth in wavering patches of light. Max lay limp beneath the pine canopy, his chest rising shallowly, barely a whisper against the hum of insects. The rag, once tied across his snout, lay discarded beside him, wet with saliva and dust. The frayed rope, still partly clinging to his back leg, now coiled loosely on the forest floor. Above him, 5 raccoons lingered in quiet formation, forming a rough semicircle like silent sentinels around their patient, Scout, the grizzled leader of the raccoon band. Crouched just inches from Max's face, her cloudy left eye flicked back and forth between his slow breaths and the deeper stillness of the woods. Her fur was coarse with mud and burrs, but her posture radiated purpose. Around her, the others shifted restlessly. One licked at the dried blood crusted on Max's paw, another nuzzled the base of his neck. None made a sound louder than a rustle. Max twitched, just once. A hind leg kicked feebly, as if grasping at the memory of running. Scout leaned forward and sniffed at his muzzle. Her instincts were ancient, older than words, older than mercy, and yet here she was, choosing to stay. A branch snapped somewhere up the slope. Scout lifted her head sharply, ears erect. The other raccoons froze, paws hovering mid-step. It wasn't a deer. The movement was careful, rhythmic, deliberate. Gus Monroe stepped out from behind a grove of mountain laurel, his frame casting a long shadow ahead of him. He was tall in the way trees are tall, solid, weathered, with deep grooves in his skin and a deliberate pace in every motion. His gray beard was trimmed short, more from habit than vanity, and his clothes were stained from years of wood smoke and pine sap, a retired ranger. He still moved like someone who could read the wind. He hadn't expected company in this part of the forest. The strange noise, chattering, rhythmic and persistent, had drawn him from his porch with a rifle slung over one shoulder. But now, as he looked down into the shallow hollow and saw what lay there, he forgot to breathe. The raccoons did not scatter. Instead, they slowly backed away, still watching. Until they formed a loose circle along the tree line, Gus lowered the rifle and crouched beside the dog. His brow furrowed deeply as his eyes traced the rope burns on Max's legs, the bruises mottling the soft flesh under fur, the raw line around his muzzle where the cloth had cut deep. He placed a hand gently on Max's side. It rose barely, but enough. "Well, boy," he muttered, voice gravel soft. "Looks like you found yourself a peculiar kind of guardian angel." Ellie appeared next, a few paces behind, her breath caught in her throat. She had followed Gus not out of curiosity but out of instinct, the same force that had driven her through the forest since she arrived, now, standing just behind her grandfather. She saw it all, Max, broken but alive, and the raccoons, still near, still watching. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Gus turned to glance at her. "You ever seen anything like this?" Ellie shook her head. The air hung heavy between them, and then, slowly, she stepped forward. She crouched beside Gus, close enough now to see the trembling in Max's limbs, the dull glint of pain in his eyes. There was something in her gaze that softened, not pity, but recognition. She reached out, tentatively, and brushed a finger across Max's ear. He didn't flinch. Gus straightened and pulled a faded blue bandana from his back pocket. He poured water from his canteen onto it and gently began cleaning the worst of Max's wounds. The raccoons began to retreat, one by one, slipping back into the underbrush. All but Scout, who remained still. Staring directly at Ellie, the girl met her gaze, unsure why, but unable to look away. Scout blinked, once, slowly. Then she turned and vanished between the ferns. From deeper in the woods, a rustle announced the presence of someone new. A moment later, a woman in her late 30s emerged from the slope. Cassie Halter, the town's volunteer wildlife medic. She was lean and sharp-angled, with sunburned skin and a long auburn ponytail tucked through a worn baseball cap. Her jeans were patched at the knees, her boots splattered with dried mud. Cassie was known for her blunt manner and fierce loyalty to anything with a heartbeat. "I heard the chatter all the way from Buckhorn Trail," she said, stepping quickly into the clearing. "What the hell?" Gus gave a slow nod. "Found him like this. Not alone, though. Raccoons cut him loose." Cassie blinked. "Come again?" Gus gestured toward the frayed rope and the prints in the soft earth. "Not kidding." Cassie knelt beside Max and immediately began checking his vitals. "He's lucky. If it had been another hour." She didn't finish. Her fingers moved fast, trained, efficient. "We need to get him to the shelter." Ellie watched silently as Gus and Cassie lifted Max onto a canvas sling. His body sagged between the poles like a rag doll. For a moment, his eyes opened, catching a sliver of sky. The air shifted somewhere behind them. The forest let out a breeze, cool and full of pine. The old ranger station sat at the edge of a winding gravel road, tucked into the northern border of the reserve where the trees thinned and the blue sky widened. The building itself was worn with time, white paint peeled from the wooden siding. The roof sagged slightly over the porch, and a rusting weather vane shaped like a hawk turned lazily in the breeze. But inside, the air was cool, clean, and filled with the faint scent of pine disinfectant. It had once been the command post for a younger Gus Monroe, back when he still wore the uniform and carried a radio clipped to his belt. Now it was just his home, and for the first time in years, it had a guest. Max lay curled on a patchwork quilt in front of the cold fireplace. His body was thinner than it should have been, the ribs still too visible beneath his dull coat. Though Cassie had cleaned and bandaged the worst of his wounds, bruises still bloomed along his side, and a stitched gash curved above one paw. His ears twitched now and then, responding to distant sounds, but mostly, he stayed quiet. He hadn't made a single bark. Cassie had left 2 hours earlier, her boots echoing down the porch steps with a promise to return the next day. Her voice had been matter-of-fact, but her eyes, a deep iron gray, had softened as she looked down at Max. She had seen enough animals abused and discarded to know which ones still carried fight in them, and which were simply waiting to be let go. Max, she said, was in between. Gus sat at the kitchen table, flipping through an old ranger's notebook, not reading. His mind drifted to the strange way the raccoons had moved, the way they had lingered. He kept replaying it, wondering if he'd imagined some part of it. Ellie sat cross-legged beside Max, one hand resting gently on his shoulder. Her fingers barely touched his fur. She had been quiet most of the day, but now, for the first time since arriving in North Carolina, she spoke without being asked. "My dad used to sit right there," she said, her voice low and rough with disuse. After work, he'd take off his boots and complain about the coffee machine. Gus looked up from the table. "I remember." He said she didn't turn to him. Instead, she looked down at Max, whose eyes were closed but whose breathing had grown more regular. "He used to bring home animals sometimes," she went on, her tone threading between memory and sadness. "Injured birds, a fox once. He said this place wasn't just for people." Max's paw twitched, Ellie's hand stilled. "I used to think he could talk to them," she whispered. Max gave a soft grunt, and Ellie leaned a little closer. "I don't know what happened to you," she said, "but I know what it's like to hurt quietly." That night, Gus lit a fire in the old stone hearth, and the warmth spread through the cabin slowly, like an old friend returning. He didn't push Ellie to talk more. He simply brought her tea and left it on the windowsill beside her, in the early hours of the morning. Ellie woke to the sound of movement. Max was trembling in his sleep, his legs twitching violently, mouth opening in silent panic. His breaths came fast, shallow, as if something unseen were chasing him. Without thinking, Ellie crawled beside him and pressed her hand firmly to his chest. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're here now." The trembling slowed. Max opened his eyes, dark brown, rimmed with gold, and locked them with hers. There was no wag of his tail, no bark, no whine, but he didn't look away, for the first time in a long while. Ellie didn't either. Later that morning, Gus drove into town to fetch more supplies, gauze, canned food, dog vitamins. He returned with a woman in the passenger seat of his truck. Dr. Helen Marlowe was the town's official veterinarian. A woman in her early 50s with thick glasses, perched on her narrow nose, and a quiet, observant way of moving. She wore a tan jacket too big for her frame, and spoke in clipped sentences, as though she were always thinking 3 steps ahead. She had once been a trauma vet in Raleigh before moving to the mountains for a quieter life. People often mistook her reserve for coldness, but in truth, she just hated small talk. Helen spent an hour examining Max. She said little as she worked, her hands gentle but firm. Ellie watched from across the room, sitting on the windowsill. When Helen finally stood, she looked at Gus and said simply, "Long-term abuse, malnourishment, older wounds, some of them healed badly. He's been through hell." "Will he make it?" Ellie asked. Helen turned to her, her gaze softening, "If he wants to in that night." Max didn't tremble in his sleep. He curled a little tighter, as if the world were just quiet enough to rest in. Ellie stayed beside him until the fire dimmed to coals. The days grew longer and warmer in the mountains, with light falling through the trees like spilled honey. The forest, once a place Ellie had walked in silence, now echoed with the soft rhythm of 4 paws beside her. Max was no longer just a shadow curled in the corner of the cabin. His gait had steadied. The wounds on his side had begun to scab and heal. His fur, though still patchy in places, had a cleaner sheen under the sunlight. He moved with caution but curiosity, always glancing back to make sure Ellie was close behind. Every morning, the girl and the dog would disappear into the woods behind the ranger station, following trails her father had once named after birds: Sparrow Bend, Finch Rock, Owl's Ridge. Gus watched them from the porch, a mug of bitter coffee in his hand and the faintest hint of a smile on his weather-worn face. He never said much, but in the quiet of the cabin's doorway, he found comfort in the sound of footsteps fading into the trees and returning again before dusk. Max and Ellie moved in a rhythm of their own. She talked more now, not a flood of words, but enough. She'd speak softly to him as they walked, about the time her father taught her to find deer tracks, or the way he could name trees by touch alone. Max didn't answer, but he listened. Sometimes. He would nudge her knee or pause beside her when she grew too quiet. One afternoon, Clouds began to gather in the distance, thick, low, and darker than usual. Ellie had ignored them at first. The trail had led her deeper into the trees, to a spot she hadn't visited since before her father's death, a clearing surrounded by tall tulip poplars where blue wildflowers still bloomed even in late summer. It had been her father's favorite place. She sat on the mossy stump he once called the thinking chair, and Max lay beside her, ears twitching as if listening to the silence settle. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the world had changed. The wind had picked up, snapping leaves off their stems. Thunder growled low like a sleeping bear disturbed. The light dimmed under a canopy of clouds, and rain began to fall, sharp and cold and fast. Ellie stood quickly, heart racing. Max barked once, a sharp sound that echoed through the trees like a flare. "We need to go," she whispered, grabbing Max's collar. But the path had vanished. The trail had turned to mud. Footprints washed away. Trees looked unfamiliar, their trunks like strangers. Every direction looked the same, and the deeper she stepped, the less sure she became by the time the rain had soaked her clothes through. Ellie was shivering. Her boots sloshed with water. Max stayed close, pressed against her legs, his fur soaked and heavy. He nudged her forward, sensing her uncertainty. They walked for what felt like hours, each turn returning them to the same thicket of underbrush or the same forked birch tree. Ellie began to cry, not loudly, but the kind that comes from deep inside, the kind that sneaks up when you've held too much too long. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Max, her voice trembling. "I should have known better." Max whined, low and steady. Then, from behind a grove of mountain laurel, a flicker of movement. Scout emerged first, her fur slick with rain, her eyes sharp and familiar. She stood still, her body low to the ground, watching them behind her. 3 more raccoons padded forward, soaked but unfazed. They formed a small arc before Ellie and Max, their presence neither threatening nor timid. Ellie blinked, stunned. "You again?" Scout stepped forward and turned her head, pausing just long enough for Ellie to understand. "Follow." They did. Scout led them with the quiet assurance of someone who had walked every inch of that forest 100 times over, through fallen logs, past flooded creeks, around brambles that caught Ellie's soaked sleeves. The other raccoons flanked them, forming a protective ring that guided and shielded finely. As the rain began to ease and the sky lightened to a murky gray, the trees thinned. Ellie gasped. Ahead, just through a gap in the branches, the cabin's roof appeared, its chimney crooked and welcome. Smoke curled weakly from the flue. Gus must have been burning something. They broke through the last stretch of brush and stepped into the clearing. The raccoons stopped just before the final line of trees. Scout turned one last time, locking eyes with Ellie. There was no sound, only the soft drip of water from leaves and the wet crunch of boots on gravel. "Thank you," Ellie said. Scout blinked slowly, then she turned and vanished, her companions slipping away like shadows swallowed by trees. Gus met them on the porch, his face drawn with worry. He took one look at Ellie's pale face and Max's shaking legs and opened the door without a word. He brought towels, hot soup, and dry clothes, and said nothing when Ellie sat on the floor beside the fireplace, her back pressed against Max's side. The dog's eyes were closed, but his body leaned gently into her. Later that night, when the wind had quieted and the rain had stopped, Gus sat alone on the porch, listening to the woods breathe again. He lit his old pipe, though he didn't smoke anymore, just liked the feel of it in his hands. He watched as the cabin lights inside flickered, shadows moving. He saw Ellie's face reflected in the window, smiling faintly, whispering something to Max. The girl, who had arrived silent and closed off, now reached for a dog who had once given up on kindness, and something in the forest had answered them both. The late summer days mellowed into golden afternoons, and the air over the Blue Ridge Mountains began to carry the faintest breath of autumn. The edges of maple leaves turned red like secrets being revealed slowly, and the nights grew cool enough for Gus to light the fireplace again, more out of ritual than need. The ranger station, long quiet and still, had found its rhythm back, marked not by radios and ranger boots, but by soft paw steps and laughter from the porch. Max had changed. He walked with more strength now, his legs steady and purposeful. His fur had begun to regain its sheen, soft and dark across his back, though a faint white scar still curled beneath one eye like a line drawn by something cruel and unfinished. He still didn't bark often, but he didn't need to, wherever Ellie went. Max was close behind, watching her with the alert eyes of someone who had once been forgotten and now refused to let anything be lost again. One Thursday morning, Gus came back from the county shelter carrying a manila folder with the official seal of Henderson County stamped in the corner. He placed it quietly on the kitchen table. Beside a plate of cornbread and honey butter Ellie had made as a surprise, signed. He said simply, "He's yours now." "Legally?" Ellie looked up, stunned, really. Gus nodded, his expression unreadable, but his voice softened. "You've both been through enough. Time for something to be official." She slid the folder open with care. Inside were the adoption papers, Max's full name written in careful print. She reached down, scratched gently behind his ear. Max leaned in with a slow blink. A quiet confirmation. That night. Ellie pulled a weathered leather journal off the top shelf in Gus's office. It was her father's, left untouched since the week he died. The spine creaked as she opened it, and the scent of old ink and pine resin rose from the pages. She carried it out onto the porch and sat down beside Max, the firelight flickering behind them. The stars were out in full, sharp, clear, and humming quietly over the treetops. She flipped through pages filled with sketches of leaves, trail maps, quick field notes, and tiny pressed flowers taped between paragraphs, near the end, in her father's precise handwriting. She found a line underlined twice. "If you see a creature in pain, man or beast, be its voice, because too many hearts go unheard in this world." Ellie closed the book slowly, her fingers resting on the quote. She looked at Max. He sat close, his body warm against her leg, his head turned toward the edge of the woods. His ears twitched, alert but not tense. He wasn't watching for danger. He was remembering something. Or someone. She followed his gaze across the clearing, just past the boundary where the firelight thinned. A shape moved between the trees, a low form, cloaked in fur, with a scar across its nose that glinted when the moon caught it just right. Scout. The raccoon stood for a moment on her hind legs, sniffing the air. Then, behind her, more eyes appeared, soft, quiet, reflecting the starlight like drops of water. The others had come too, the whole small band that had once pulled Max from the brink. None approached. They stood still, like witnesses. Max didn't move, he simply looked. And Scout, after a long pause, lowered herself back to all fours, turned, and vanished into the brush. No sound, no ceremony, but her presence said everything. Gus came out a few minutes later, his hands in his pockets. He didn't ask what they were looking at. He'd seen enough in his years to understand that not everything needed explanation. "You know," he said quietly, "your dad used to say the forest never really forgets. It watches, learns, forgives. If you let it." Ellie nodded. She turned to Gus and offered the journal. "I think I want to finish it," she said. "Write the rest, about Max, about Scout." Gus smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't show in the mouth but lingers in the eyes. That'd be a good story. The next morning, Ellie opened a fresh page and began to write. In a world that often moves too fast to notice the broken, this story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, sometimes through the eyes of a wounded dog, or the gentle mercy of wild creatures, or the love of a child who dares to hope again. Max was saved not by force, but by compassion, by a forest that listened, by animals with no voice yet endless empathy, and by a girl whose heart was brave enough to care. It was not coincidence, it was grace, in that moment, through creatures of the earth. God was speaking. Maybe you felt forgotten. Maybe you've seen someone in pain and didn't know how to help. This story is a call to open your eyes and your heart, because the quiet acts of kindness you choose today may be the miracle someone else is praying for. If this story moved you, share it. Leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel to help us bring more true stories of hope and healing into the world. And if you believe that compassion, even from the wildest corners of creation, is a gift from God, type Amen in the comments and say a prayer for all the Macs still waiting to be seen. May God bless you for every heart you choose not to ignore.